Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us your sources, and we've been digging through them to bring you the most interesting, most important insights.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
And today, we're diving deep into, well, a brand new study using ancient DNA. We're heading back, way back, about 3,000 years to the northern Iranian Plateau.
Exactly. It's a look at the genetic story of the people there, starting from the Copper Age. That's around, 4,700 BCE?
Right?
All the way through empires rising and falling, ending up with the Sassanids around 651 CE.
And the source material for this, it's DNA, actual ancient DNA, pulled from skeletons found at 9 different archaeological sites across Iran.
That's right. And they really got a good amount of data, 50 samples analyzed overall.
50? Wow.
Yeah, which resulted in 23 new mitogenomes. That's the maternal line ancestry,
Traces the mother side.
And 13 nuclear genomes, which give us that much broader whole picture view of their genetics.
So the mission for this deep dive, basically, is to figure out the genetic connections. How much continuity was there over those thousands of years? How diverse were these populations?
And how did they connect with their neighbors, like, people in the South Caucasus or South Central Asia? Plus, how did big historical events, empires, trade routes, how might those have left a mark on their genes?
Okay, so let's start near the beginning then. There was a really interesting early find, right? A new sample from the early Chalcolithic.
Yes, that one's quite significant. It actually predates any other genomes we had from the Chalcolithic in Iran before this.
So it's the oldest of its kind found there so far.
Exactly. And genetically, its ancestry looks mostly like the early Neolithic Iranians.
The first farmers in the area.
Pretty much, yeah, from the Zagros region. It really suggests a strong long-term continuity. These groups stuck around.
But it wasn't totally isolated, even back then. You mentioned hints of other influences?
That's a key point. Even this very early sample shows some genetic traces connecting westward. So, interaction was happening even thousands of years ago, not a sealed-off community.
Okay, now the study really zooms in on northern Iran during the big empires. Achaemenid, Parthian, Sassanid, that's roughly 355 BCE to 460 CE? A long time.
A very historically important period, yes. And the DNA from individuals living then, it places them, genetically speaking, kind of in the middle.
Middle of what?
Of an east-west genetic spectrum, like a gradient that stretched right across the Persian Plateau. They weren't purely Eastern or purely Western in their ancestry mix, but somewhere, in between.
Reflecting that mix of influences. And were they completely different from the people before them, or were there still connections?
Oh, definitely connections. Strong ones, in fact. They showed clear genetic links back to the local Bronze Age populations who lived there earlier.
Okay.
And also connections eastward, towards South Central Asia. These weren't just fleeting contacts. The genetics suggest really enduring relationships.
Right.
And what's really convincing is when they looked at the specific lines, the maternal mtDNA and the paternal Y chromosome DNA, the patterns there also backed up this idea of population stability, from prehistoric times right through.
So deep roots in the region, alongside those connections outwards. Let's dig into those specific genetic components then. The study talks about the Persian Plateau being a kind of crossroads.
It absolutely was, geographically, a critical path for early humans migrating out of Africa, for starters. And they found evidence of this really ancient lineage called Basal Eurasian.
Basal Eurasian?
Yeah, it's like a very early branch on the human family tree, splitting off before the main groups that became Europeans and East Asians really diverged. It gives us a glimpse deep, deep into the past of these populations.
And then, over time, the genetic picture changed, starting with those early Neolithic farmers.
Right. The study suggests they were related to hunter-gatherers from the nearby Alborz Mountains and also shared ancestry with Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Then, moving into the Chalcolithic.
The Copper Age?
Exactly. We see farmers who also have ancestry linked to the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, and to those Anatolian Neolithic farmers from modern-day Turkey. So those westward connections we talked about, they seem to get stronger.
And then the Bronze Age brings even more complexity. Influences from the east and north this time.
Precisely. This is when we start seeing components related to Andamanese hunter-gatherers, or AHG.
Andamanese.
Yeah.
From the islands in the Indian Ocean, that's far.
It is. Finding that link, even if it's small, suggests some really ancient connections or maybe shared ancestry from a long, long time ago. We also see ancient North Eurasian or ANE ancestry popping up linked to Siberian groups and steppe-related ancestry from the north.
And you can pinpoint where some of these first appeared.
Yeah, like that AHG component. It shows up first in the samples from Shari Sokhta, a big Bronze Age city in eastern Iran. It's like a genetic marker appearing at a specific time and place.
Fascinating. And this mixing just continued into the Iron Age.
It looks like it. The Iron Age shows more gene flow from the Levant, ongoing connections there, and even the arrival of a specific East Asian maternal line, haplogroup D, in the north. So you can really picture this region as a melting pot, constantly receiving trickles and sometimes streams of new ancestry over millennia.
It's amazing how DNA holds on to these ancient stories. What about burial practices? Did the study connect those to the genetics?
It did, yeah. They discussed these specific catacomb-style graves found across the plateau, often linked to the Parthian period.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that the earliest forms of this burial style seem to pop up even earlier in southeastern Iran, near Jiroft, before places like Shari Sokhta or sites in Central Asia.
So maybe the idea, the cultural practice, spread from there.
That's the suggestion. It hints at cultural flow alongside or maybe independent of gene flow. And this tradition then seems to reappear or become prominent again in northern Iran during the Parthian and Sassanid times. So maybe a continuity of tradition or a revival?
It takes some serious science to get this kind of information from ancient bones. Can you give us a quick rundown of the methods they used?
Sure. It involves really careful extraction of the ancient DNA itself, which is obviously quite fragile. Then they use techniques like shotgun sequencing, basically reading all the DNA fragments they can get.
Okay.
But they also use targeted capture methods, they mentioned, using arbor and twist, which are specific kits to really focus on sequencing the whole genome and the mitochondrial DNA specifically.
Get more detail on the important part.
Exactly. And then comes the analysis. Lots of complex statistics, things like PCA, principal component analysis, which helps visualize how different groups relate genetically.
Like plotting them on a map based on their DNA.
Sort of, yeah. And admixture analysis, which tries to figure out the proportions of different ancestral ingredients in each individual, plus other tests like F-statistics and KPIDM to test specific ideas about population relationships and mixture.
It sounds like a powerful toolkit. Any specific results from the methodology side that were particularly notable?
Yeah, a couple of things. They actually identified a pair of genetically identical twins at one site, Lyersangbon. Finding twins in the archaeological record is incredibly rare.
Wow. Identical twins.
And also from Lyersangbon, they found one individual with signs of high inbreeding long stretches of identical DNA, called wrens of homozygosity, or ROH.
Meaning their parents were likely closely related.
Probably, yes. But interestingly, other people from the same site had very few of these ROH segments, suggesting they came from a more mixed, more outbred background, maybe newcomers or from families that mixed more widely.
And what about population size? Did the DNA give clues about that?
It did. The analysis suggested that some of the earlier prehistoric sites had relatively small effective population sizes. That's roughly the number of people contributing genes to the next generation.
Okay.
But they saw an increase in this effective size over time from the Neolithic up to the Iron Age. So populations likely grew and maybe became more interconnected.
Let's switch focus slightly to those maternal and paternal lines, the mtDNA and Y chromosomes. What did they reveal?
Looking at the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, West Eurasian lineages were the most common throughout, from prehistory right into the historical periods.
So a core continuity there.
Yes, but the Bronze Age saw more variety creep in. New maternal haplogroups like different branches on the mother's side of the family tree appeared, including, later on, some lineages that originated in East Eurasia, which fits with archaeological ideas about increased movement then.
And the paternal side, the Y chromosomes.
The main players there were haplogroups J, G, L, R, and T. But significantly, they also found haplogroup H, which is common in South Asia, in some Chalcolithic and Bronze Age individuals.
More evidence for those connections eastward.
Exactly. And some of these paternal lines, like G, J, P1, and R2, seem to have been in the region for a very, very long time. Deep continuous roots on the male side, too.
Did they trace any specific Y haplogroups, like the J lineages?
They did. They looked at J1, which seems to have originated in the western part of the Persian Plateau, and J2, maybe more northwestern and western. Seeing how these spread over time helps map out movements within the region itself.
Okay, so putting all these genetic threads together, What's the big picture? How did the overall population structure look, and did it shift much over these 3,000 years?
Well, that PCA analysis we mentioned, comparing the ancient Iranians to others, it revealed patterns like a southern steppe cline and an Indus periphery cline, basically showing gradual genetic shifts related to those areas.
Right.
And the very earliest samples, Mesolithic and early Neolithic, they really stood out on these plots, genetically quite distinct.
And they had mixture results, breaking down the ancestry.
That showed the mix, components related to early sites like Ganj Dareh, Anatolian farmers, the Andamanese-related ancestry, ancient North Eurasians. It quantifies that mix we talked about.
And that east-west cline, the gradient across the plateau, did that hold up over time?
It seems so, yes. It was visible from the Neolithic onwards. As you move west, you generally see more ancestry related to Anatolian farmers and the Levant. They point to Tepe-Hisar in the east and Sagabi in the west during the Chalcolithic as clear examples showing this difference.
But the main chunk of ancestry in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age
Still seem to be linked back to those earlier Mesolithic and early Neolithic Iranians, especially in the east, like at Shari Sokhta, and also over in Turkmenistan.
Interesting.
And there was a noticeable degree of genetic similarity, kind of a homogeneity, between groups in Iran, Turkmenistan, and even Uzbekistan during the Chalcolithic Bronze Age.
Maybe reflecting those big cultural hubs and trade networks connecting everyone.
That's a strong possibility, yeah. Centers like Shari Sokhta and Tepe-Hisar could have really fostered those links.
But despite all this mixing potential,
Yeah.
you still see continuity, especially in the north later on.
Absolutely. That Caucasus hunter-gatherer and early Neolithic Iranian ancestry remains really prominent in the Iron Age and historical period samples from northern Iran, like from sites called Marsin Chal, Lir Sangban, and Vestamin.
Okay.
Though the Lir Sangban individuals did have an extra bit of Western Anatolian-related ancestry, which kind of makes sense given where it is, and they even found Egyptian artifacts there, hinting at wider connections.
What about the influence from the steppe? That's often a big factor in Bronze Age genetics elsewhere.
Here in northern Iran, during the historical period, the study suggests the steppe affinities they see are mostly down to shared ancestry with the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, rather than a big new wave of steppe migration into this specific area at that later time.
So it's more about shared deep roots than recent arrivals.
It looks that way for this region, yes. When they tried to model the historical individual's genetics, the best fit was often with prehistoric groups from northeast Iran or south-central Asia, putting them back on that established east-west cline.
And they had one medieval sample, too.
Just one, from Kalmakara. It showed similarities to modern northwestern Iranians, maybe suggesting some westward shifts or continuity there, and perhaps a gradual decrease of that earliest Iran Neolithic ancestry component in the west over the very long term.
And how do modern Iranians fit into all this ancient variation?
Modern Iranians carry much of this ancient genetic legacy, but they generally lack that specific Indus periphery cline signature that was more prominent back in the Bronze Age.
Okay, so let's try and boil this down. After this 3,000-year genetic journey, what are the main headlines?
I'd say first, definitely the evidence for long-term genetic continuity in the northern Iranian Plateau. People stuck around.
Right.
Second, the importance of that ancient east-west genetic gradient. It really shaped the populations that came later. Third, the clear, enduring genetic ties linking the plateau to the Caucasus to Central Asia.
Okay.
Fourth, maybe surprisingly, the relatively minor impact of direct Bronze Age steppe migrations on the genetics of northern Iran during the historical period compared to some other places. And finally, just the overall picture of remarkable genetic stability over centuries, with the ancient variation forming the bedrock for modern Iranian diversity, albeit with some subtle changes over time.
It is absolutely fascinating. It shows how interconnected human history really is, written right there in our DNA. So what's the wider importance of this study, then, for understanding ancient Western Asia as a whole?
Well, it adds a really crucial piece to the puzzle. It gives us vital new data on Iran's genetic past, especially the northern regions, which haven't been studied as much with ancient DNA. It confirms this complex picture continuity mixed with influences from all around.
And presumably it points the way for more research.
Oh, definitely. Like all good science, it answers some questions but raises new ones. The authors themselves say we need more research to really map out the diversity within ancient Iran, especially during the Iron Age and in the southwest, where they didn't have as many samples for this particular study.
Right. Always more to uncover. So here's something to think about. Final thought for you listening. Given this incredibly long history, This deep genetic continuity, combined with constant interaction across the northern Iranian plateau and beyond. What does that make us think about ideas like national or ethnic identity in a region that's been so interconnected for so long? What questions does this raise for you about how people have always moved, mixed, and shaped each other throughout history?
Something to ponder.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.